Business meeting of the Borough of Gettysburg Planning Commission. We call this meeting to order at 7:02 p.m. I note that we have one missing Planning Commission member, John Rice. So Jenny Dumont, our alternate member, will participate fully in voice and vote at today's meeting until perhaps John arrives. Other than the Planning Commission members, we have our solicitor, Adam Boyer, and our Borough engineer, Chad Claybaugh, and our planning director, John Whitmore. And thanks to all of you for participating in this meeting, either because you are in the room or you helped to fund community media to film this. And so thank you to those residents who once again paid privately to fund our meeting. Let's begin by reviewing and approving our agenda. First, we have the minutes from the November 18th meeting. Then there will be public comment for items on the agenda. We have no tabled old business. We continue to have one item of new business, and that is the rezoning effort. But please know that we can start to see the light at the end of the tunnel of this effort. We have 7 items that are unfinished and hopefully will be resolved today related to that rezoning effort. Planning Commission members, in front of you, I have tried to go through the minutes for the last year and a half and pull out from the minutes any item related to rezoning and put it in one document. Then there is another document, which is a spreadsheet of all the comments that I believe that we have received either at public comment time or through John Whitmore or on the website or anywhere else, and put it into one spreadsheet. So the idea would be that if we're moving to a vote in the new year, in January, which is proposed, or if it has to go to February, but maybe January, that you would check all of the items between the minutes and those requests. Of course, sometimes we did not answer a request in exactly the way a resident wanted, but most of the time we tried to, or at least we discussed it. And then to just help John, and John will later explain how the consultant is involved still in revising the draft, and just ensure that we have done our work, that before we recommend this and put our name on this as the Gettysburg Planning Commission, that we have checked to be sure that all resident comments have been considered and that all the decisions we made at our many meetings have been included in this draft that we propose to council. So that's what's in front of you. After that, there are announcements. Planning Commission members have an opportunity to speak, and then there's one final round of public comment. Are there any corrections to the agenda, or is there a motion to approve?
I'll make a motion to approve the agenda.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
So Sarah moved and Marty seconded. Any further discussion? All those in favor of approving our agenda, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? And we have an agenda. How about the November 18th meeting minutes that John sent out? Any corrections to those minutes, or is there a motion to approve?
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes as presented.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Sarah moved and Marty seconded. Any discussion on the minutes? All those in favor of approving the November 18th minutes, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? And the minutes pass. If the public has any item related to the agenda, which is any item related to rezoning, could you please come to the microphone and state your name and residence and let us know what you're thinking? Oh, could you use that? Speak into the mic so that community media can.
Thanks. Hi, my name is Doug Stevens. I'm here on behalf of Victorian Carriage Company. Very interesting in the planning zone. But the reason I'm here is because I think it's on page 180 of your document there. It has a map of the new zoning. I'm looking to have 100 York Street be zoned in the what they call OC, which I think represents Old City. That way we can have tour operations, because we're in a tourist town. You think it would be okay to have tour operations out of a tourist town. Right now, I currently have carriage tours that we run out of different locations. I'm looking forward to utilizing the historic Eddie Plank building as being historic and have tour operations out there to bring more people into the town through our carriages and through our walking tours and other operations. So I'm just requesting that we can look at that zoning map and maybe include the 100 York Street. And I believe Mr. John Whitmore has an email I sent earlier, so you have a documentation of the same request. Okay, any questions?
I think we're good. We received the email, so we'll add that to the list for
Okay,
consideration.
thank you very much.
Is there any other public comment? Okay, there is another public comment at the end, and if there is something very urgent that you'd like to respond to while we're going through these, just please raise your hand. So, John, could you begin by explaining to us where we are in the document itself between Michael Baker International and what you put on the website, I believe, on Friday before we move through these items?
Okay, so been working with Troy Truex with Michael Baker on obtaining an actual fully customizable document. There were some issues with how the images were are in the previous Word document. So that wasn't received until I believe it was either Saturday or Sunday. We now have a new map which we'll be able to present as well. But in terms of the physical document, there's some changes that have to occur within each of the districts. There's an image that shows the specific build requirements, massing requirements for structures. So that'll be edited. Other than that, we've received a few comments on just some typos and things like that, so we'll get those fixed. But otherwise, we're nearing the finish line for a product. Once we get some clarification with these items that are on tonight's agenda, we should have a final draft ready for presentation and hopefully adoption.
Okay, the one caveat, though, is I want to be sure that we're able to use this document to check that everything has been done. So what document can we use before January to do that?
So what we can do, staff will be updating based on tonight that Word document that we now have that's completely customizable.
Okay.
We will have that out by, let's see, we'll be able to get that out by the 20th of December, so Friday. Assuming there aren't any further delays, we would be able to have the information packet out prior to Friday as well. That's something that's at the general information handout that's on the agenda further.
Yeah.
We had hoped to have this completed by today, but there were just delays in the process, and we'll be able to hopefully get to a point where that won't affect us. But yeah, we will not be able to make the December deadline of approval tonight.
So yeah, these items here, these are up for debate and decision by the commission. All the other things that we're checking are things that we've already decided that we pulled from the minutes, just to make sure those made them into the final document. That's what I'm suggesting, not to add any more decision making, but to cross-reference. And I think we could do that after December 20th and have it ready by January.
Yes.
Okay. All right, then would you like to begin, either Chad or John, on this question of build two lines and setbacks, which is an unresolved item?
I can give you some information to get you started. So what we've noticed was that there was some inconsistencies with the draft ordinance and what is in your existing ordinance in terms of the build to. First, let me say, I said in all the committee meetings with the consultant, and the intent wasn't to make any changes. It was to make it as consistent with the existing ordinance as possible. But one of the things that we identified whenever, even our existing ordinance has some challenges whenever you start to try to tell how to measure the build to, because our existing ordinance measures it off the curb line, and the curb line changes. Sometimes streets change. At the square, for instance, the curb line bumps out. There's more streetscapes we're doing where the curb line bumps out. We just changed the curb line on South Street, so that makes it challenging. And there's places where the build to could be less than the actual property that they have. If the curb line got bumped in and the build to was 5 or 10 feet, they could be building off of their property, which isn't permitted. So there were some challenges with the way it was read. The proposed ordinances in all of the zones has the build to based off of the lot line. In each one of the pages where you have the little drawings of the lots with the setbacks, it says that they're specified from the lot line, and they're shown in the picture that way. However, they used the exact same dimensions from the existing ordinance. So they basically didn't capture the fact that there's 10 feet maybe of curb and sidewalk. So the build to in all of these zones, as it's written, is essentially 10 feet more than what it is in your existing ordinance. So obviously that's not the intent. Again, the intent was to make them match, be the exact same thing. It's just the way it was measured. And the way it's measured is in the back. It's on, I'm looking at the version. This is not the track change version. It's page 139. If you wanted to play along, this is where you describe the build twos. There's two inconsistent paragraphs there. The first paragraph for the build to established is exactly as it's read in the existing ordinance, where it says it's based off the curb line. But then the next line says that it should be as specified in part 2, which again is where it goes to the lot line. So we'll fix that. That's not, I don't think we need to dive into the specifics of that. I think the goal is tonight to let us know, let John know, and he can take us back to Troy, if you want to change the build to in any of the existing districts. Again, basically what you see in your written in the ordinance for every single district is exactly the way it exists. And by the way, every district in Gettysburg has a build to. We don't really have a minimum front setback. All right, so let's establish that right off the bat. Like you're thinking about township ordinances where they say you got to sit back at least 25 feet, but then you can go back as far as you want to after that. In Gettysburg, it's build to, you got to be within plus or minus 4 feet, I believe, is our build to requirements. And that's in that section, same section. Yeah, that's the same section on page 139. You got to be plus or minus 4 feet of that number. And that's every district, including the industrial district where the college is. Now, there is one caveat in the college where it says for every foot of a added building height, you can go a foot further back. Because there is a lot of college buildings that are obviously sit back further than your typical build to. But everywhere else in the borough, it has been pretty much the standard that you need to build the building at the back of the sidewalk or pretty close to the back of the sidewalk, consistent with the face of all the rest of the buildings on that street. So I guess the question is, and it could be just as simple as we want to keep it as consistent with the existing ordinance as possible. And that could be a real quick discussion, all in favor, and we move on. Or you can go through each one of the zones and say, because we do have some zones that are a little bit different. You know, we had the old Elm Street overlay, which had a build-to requirement. And now we don't have that anymore. We have that neighborhood commercial district, which is kind of consistent with what the Elm Street overlay was. Again, the goal was to try to match as closely to the existing ordinance as possible, even though the zones aren't exactly the same, and the boundaries of the zones aren't exactly the same. So there are going to be some inconsistencies. So again, the question I guess to start with is how deep do you want to dive into this topic? Do you want to go through each zone individually, or do you just want to say, hey, yeah, I like the way it is in our existing ordinance, let's keep it like that, and that's the direction we'll give back to staff.
John, do you want to add anything to that?
No, that's a pretty succinct discussion of the issue. With regards to, yeah, we need direction just with that general caveat. If everything's working with current districts, we can make those changes relatively easily.
So I'm counting on my colleagues here to engage this. In July, we received these comments from Sue Sipperly related to this very topic that I don't think we ever addressed. I wondered if John or Chad read those comments and could advise in responding to them. And then more recently, we received something related to how the county defines the building setback line. And I just have to admit, this area is not very clear in my mind. So I wonder if others have some more expert thoughts on it. And Chad, do you want to respond to Sue's comments back from July?
Pull up, so I did get Sue's, and I believe these are the same. Same as the recent one, right? So. Yeah, so Sue's comment was, The current ordinance specifies a build to, which creates difficulties where the yard is, quote unquote, becomes problematic when dealing with fence height. Uses that need to be allowed only in the back or side yard. I've included a diagram from when this process started to refresh your memory. And she gave some diagrams, and it talks about the yard requirements. So I really haven't had a chance to dive into the specific there of the yard requirements, but that was the first of her comments. And the second of the comments was the definition of building envelope. And she gave us some information on building line, which relates to the location of the other buildings along the street. And again, the goal there is that the buildings line up with a build to. The building line is where all the buildings line up. So that was the 2 points in Sue's email, and there was a couple of attachments that she gave us with that. And I'd be happy to go through any of those if you want to. I think that, and I don't mean to paint with a broad brush, but I think the goal, again, with the build to is that all the streets line up, all the buildings line up on that same street within plus or minus 4 feet. That's what the current ordinance is. And if you like how far from the curb line or the front property line that the current zones are, then we can basically write the ordinance in a similar fashion.
Right.
We have to clean up some of that inconsistent language that Sue's pointing out.
But if you define yard in a certain way, is her point you don't have to define build to?
You still should.
Okay.
One of the aspects that the build to line's trying to accommodate for is potential challenges and variances that are going to arise from neighboring property owners who you're going to be affected if the property's going, if it has to be not designed the way you like it to be. So if in that which case, like having to, traditionally you'd have a setback, a front setback saying the minimum, you have to be at least 25 feet off of the either front parcel boundary or curb line. Then that becomes your front yard. The yard, you can either put a requirement in, I believe we do have certain requirements, they can't be used for parking. How that can actually be to establish what it's going to functionally look like and how it's going to functionally be utilized. Especially when this comes into residential design and things like that, it becomes a very important part. But when you get into the more downtown area, making sure the build to line, because then you don't want a situation where you have the more suburban style design enabling potential front parking lots, detracting from pedestrian friendly environment. So it is.
Okay.
It's a very complex issue to discuss, but
So maybe if you put, I don't know if you can put the current definition on, because I think what you're asking us to do is to see if there's anything wrong with this or if there should be any district-specific changes. So maybe let's start there, Planning Commission. Do we see any problem with the current language, and can we direct staff in a way that responds to that problem?
So I think some of your higher congested streets like Baltimore Street, you have a very tight corridor there with the building setbacks, and then you have to fit in, signs, fire hydrants, telephone poles. And you have these stoops then that come out, and so your sidewalk then gets limited. So my only concern with these setbacks would be in these higher density areas where to meet ADA requirements, it becomes challenging when you add in all of the other infrastructure. It can be done, it's being done right now, but that is the only concern, especially for events when you would have lots of people.
So what districts do you think we want to watch?
Well, I think it's one of these things where there is no good solution. It's, if they could imagine Gettysburg, 150 years ago, what it would be today, maybe things would have been done a little differently. But the fact that it was laid out then, and then the automobile came along, and you have a wider street going through with parking on either side, really limits the amount of people that you can have then. Walking comfortably. I'll also note, so a while back, I believe somebody brought a a picture that they had got off the internet of a building, a 6-story building, down at where the Getty is to sort of show us what a 6-story building looked like. And I thought it was interesting that she had the setback was actually more than what would be required. It would be required to be closer to the street, at least from what I could judge by. The setbacks are quite tight, so that building that she had superimposed in that area would have actually been closer to the street. And just a few notes there, but I think I would stick with the existing. It's worked this long, and
Yeah, I'm trying to think of examples in the past where we've had requests for variances or applicants who expressed a concern about build-to lines. I'm not coming up with any off the top of my head. You can think of a couple?
Yeah, I know of two, and there was actually a third one that really never came to fruition. But the first one that you probably remember is McDonald's. They wanted to build back further, and they had to build forward. And then that ended up being an issue with their signage and stuff. But when McDonald's rebuilt, that was one of the ones I can remember. There was also it was the City Mart wanted to build back further, and they haven't completed their land development. It got withdrawn, but the land development plan they originally presented got denied, and then they had to change their building arrangement so that part of the building was up to Carlisle Street. There was a third one that I can remember. This was the old developer for the Ready site originally wanted to build away from Stratton Street. And the zoning officer at the time said, no, you can't do that. That has to be built out along Stratton Street. The middle school came up, that's right, yeah. And now that one got the variance. Yes, the middle school got a variance.
So, in my opinion, those examples, and to me, the conclusions reached were the correct ones, I think, it sounds like. I do remember, I think, I feel like I heard some public astonishment when Foursquare was built, that there was a building that tall that was built right against the sidewalk, but that was, I don't think that was just what the code permitted. So I think there may be some consideration with the fact that taller buildings, and the example of the college is a good one, that the further back they go, it makes more sense, or the taller they are, the more sense it makes to have them further from the sidewalk. But I guess the only thought I have on this matter is that, based on what you were explaining earlier, to me it makes more sense not to use the curb line, since curb lines would get changed if we're doing road diets and any number of things. So I think changing that definition, and I was going to look for the definition in the new draft, which still does have the two build-to line definitions, but they both talk about the street distance from the street curb line, which to me seems like it sounds like you're prepared to change it throughout to, I guess, what are you going to do?
Right now it says it both ways, so it needs
Okay.
to be one way or the other.
Right.
I think the better way is just go with the lot line. And the only reason why I think that works in Gettysburg is because every property that I know of, 90% of them, the lot line is the back of sidewalk, essentially. Is
that right?
The street right-of-way isn't really a right-of-way. It's kind of fee simple title that the borough has title to the street. It's not really a right-of-way per se. Their front lot line is pretty consistent, 50 feet generally for all the streets in the borough. That space between the buildings is the front lot line.
So you're saying, unlike my experience outside of the borough in townships where your lot line goes to the center of the road,
Yep,
it does not
exactly.
happen
That
here.
does not happen
Okay.
in most boroughs, including this borough. Or, a farm tract might be just a big farm tract, 200 acres with a street that goes right through the middle of it, and it's just a right-of-way that goes through
Right.
the middle, and there is no, lot line at all along the street on the farm. Or sometimes they just go right to the center of the street. But in Gettysburg, that is not the case. They all stop at the right-of-way line, essentially.
Okay. That would make the most sense to me then. It's my,
Okay.
Chad, what about a situation I'm thinking on Long Lane there's properties that like are supposed to have sidewalks but don't. Like, where does the building lot line fall in that? Like, we would ideally want them to have sidewalks, but currently right now it's just curb.
But there's still a curb. So the way the existing ordinance reads the curb line.
Right.
And if there's no curb, it's the edge of pavement. It does say that as well.
Okay.
But it doesn't say anything about the sidewalks.
Right, but that's what I'm wondering, in this situation, if we were to switch to recommend changing to something that is more to your point of a building lot line rather than the curb to account for sidewalks, how would it handle those situations where there is no sidewalk? Is the building lot line, I guess, where's the building lot line in that scenario?
Typically, yeah, and in the cases you're talking about in Long Lane, the building lot line would still be behind where the sidewalk would go.
It should be, okay.
Almost always the sidewalk is actually in that 50-foot, fee simple title, the right-of-way of the street. Hardly ever is the sidewalk actually past the front lot line.
It definitely should be, and luckily, the borough, being so compact, all of this has already been decided. I mean, I don't think we've had an abandonment question. Yeah, so I mean, other jurisdictions, you'll have a lot of questions when it comes to design, but here it's pretty well laid out. We can actually probably give you a justification for what to expect along those, like Long Lane, but then also some other streets just to give some justification. We can put that together in the coming weeks.
So far, it sounds like continuing with what we have, with the exception of what you two discussed about lot line versus curb line. But could we just resolve, just so that we know we've responded to this, the question about the yard and how, I'm talking about Sue's email from last evening that we all received. The current ordinance specifies a build-to line which creates difficulties where the yard is. This becomes problematic when dealing with fence height and uses that need to be allowed only in the back or side yard. How do you see that as a potential conflict?
The issue with yard, it's twofold, because we're in one level we're regulating front yard activities. Swimming pools are an example. You can't have those in the front or side yard. There's like the parking spaces, you can't have those in the front yard. You can have driveways, which that gets a little funky. Well, even that's a long way of saying, if directed, what would make the most sense is probably having the discussion of a yard as it relates to front setbacks or in front build-to lines. Maybe we can identify if there are any we haven't identified if there are any incompatibilities now. It's something we could do. It's not something that's come up in my practice with the borough.
I guess I'm just trying to make sure that if we do this, we're not opening trouble related to fences and swimming pools and front yards.
That's the potential. Alternatively, I mean, it wasn't something that was necessarily more pressing than establishing how we want to handle this even the concept of what the front setback, front yard, front build-to line, whatever it's going to be. If we can get direction on how the planning commission would like front yards to be utilized, then we can also take that into account.
Yeah, is this a question that's more about what is allowed in the front yard, or is it a question about how the build-to is defined as also a front yard? Because I think that's part of the goal. If you look at the build-to definition, and I believe Sue even pointed to this in the last of the attachments that she provided.
Yes, please just resolve this. Yeah.
The couple of issues with the build-to is where do you measure it from? And it's inconsistent all over town where your property line is. Up on Red Patch, it's on the inside of the sidewalk. my deed says I own to the curb. And my build-to line is 10 feet, which brings it to my front yard, but on my house is 30 feet back. So, because there's a dimension on that build-to line of 10 feet, it's nonsense, and the definition says the build-to line is where my front yard is, and there's a no man's land between the build-to line and my house. And I know of cases, 3 of them, 2 on Stratton, that were told they could have a 6-foot-tall fence all the way to the build-to line, which is well past the house. So if I had my preference, I would say get rid of a dimensional build-to line. Solve a lot of the problems you're talking about, and use that concept that was in the handout, and that the county also uses, of a building line, which is just wherever the houses are on your street. It's sort of, that's like you have a setback that tells you how far back you have to be. Now we have a build-to line that tells you can't be that far back, you have to be 10 feet from the street. And your yard should be between your house and the street or your property line, but it isn't. So technically, you could build a 6-foot-tall fence down to the sidewalk where I live, and then a 6-foot fence across the front. Because of that 10-foot number. If you want to use building line instead and just say, within the average building line of the houses on the street so they all line up, it's a lot easier. It makes more sense.
All right, thank you, Sue. So that provides a little more clarity there. Any reactions to that?
So that would present a dynamic approach. We do, E right here kind of provides that utilizing the majority of the existing buildings on the block face to establish that build-to line, that building line. It does take away from the notion that the applicant would be able to readily identify what their front yard is. So there is that consideration. However, it's kind of minor. I don't think even going to that scenario wouldn't be a huge problem for the borough, and it would still be meeting the goal and intent of having a build-to line.
But what about streets, or especially commercial streets maybe, where there is not a clear sense of where all the buildings line up, and the planning actually wants to reform the street somehow?
There is they're platted. We have platted right of way. We have platted cartways. We know where the fronts are.
But that was going to be my exact
Yeah.
question. I think Charles made a good point. There's a lot of development that's happened where you don't necessarily know what the Shippensburg PT is a perfect example. There was no other buildings on that street.
Right, that's exactly what I'm
So
talking
they
about.
would have not had to build to the front. They could have built wherever they want to if they would have followed the building line. Now, I don't hate Sue's recommendation for where there is buildings. I think that actually kind
So
of
can we-
makes more sense. But where, like the school, the middle school would have been another one. McDonald's wouldn't have been built forward. That would have been back where Friendly's and all the rest of them are. The Best Western wouldn't have been built the way it was. The Appalachian Brewing Company wouldn't have been built where it was, because those are with Friendly's, and the Kentucky Fried Chicken. I mean, some of those buildings are sitting back further.
And we wanted to change that.
Yeah,
With
yeah, the
future
planning
construction,
commission
that-
wanted them
I
built
wonder if there's a way to do
forward, yeah.
both, where there is an existing building line that we like, that makes sense in that area. It should be what Sue says, and in areas where we've tried to change development, it's something else. So you're trying to get in here?
I was just going to say, if you're going to do kind of that dynamic standard, you want to be careful. Are you doing it for the street, or are you doing it for the block? Or are you doing it just for one side of the street versus the aggregate of both sides of the street? Because some sides are not necessarily the same as the other side of the street. I'm thinking York Street particularly.
At this point, we've discussed this a while. I think we need to give some direction to John to turn this into some language for the ordinance. And then maybe a couple options, maybe. I don't
I'll
know.
just reiterate, this has not been something that has been a huge problem with our existing ordinance. And even with the issues we've discussed, the variances that have been approved or that have been sought have been mostly for non-residential.
But but the comment about 6-foot fences in front yards seems a little concerning.
Well, that's not
I'm surprised.
allowed
I'm surprised by
currently.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at fences on 27,407, so obviously, I think we've discussed earlier, there's a question of where does the build-to line start? Is it the curb? Is it the back of the sidewalk? I think we talked about hopefully getting a better answer to that, some suggestions based off of lot line. But currently, the way fences are talked about is that the first section, no fences more than 6 feet, except as stipulated under subparagraph B. And B says fences shall not exceed 4 feet in height in the front yard area between the street right-of-way and the required building setback or build-to lines. So in this scenario where we are determining build-to lines from the back of the sidewalk to the front of the property, a 4-foot fence could be erected in the space between the sidewalk and the property. As I'm reading the fence on
But
27,407.
that no man's land that she was referring to.
I don't understand.
That would
what
be,
the no man's
if the build-to line is 10 feet, but the building doesn't actually, the building is 30 feet setback, then there's 20 feet of yard.
But it says no. It says in the front yard. Doesn't,
I mean, and that's, the way I'm reading it is the back of the sidewalk is here, 10 feet to the build-to line, you can put a front fence of 4 feet in the middle, in those 10 feet, from the back of the sidewalk to your property.
But isn't the idea that the build-to line says 10 feet, but some houses are built 30 feet back?
well, does it matter? It's the front yard. Is what it
So
says
the
in
whole front yard.
Is that what it says?
I thought you said only to the build-to line.
I mean, the way it reads now, it says, in the front yard area between the street right-of-way and required building setback or build-to lines.
Yes, so that's
what
it.
you're saying.
So
So
you're
there's a-
suggesting we change that to the existing,
I don't know what I'm suggesting. I'm just pointing out the issue.
Okay. So it should say the build-to line or existing structure, I guess. Is that the issue?
That could
Or
solve it, yeah.
non-conforming structure?
Non-conforming.
yeah, or non-conforming structure. Because I would be hesitant about using the average. I think we are deciding what we would like to see, understanding that there's non-conforming and having a stipulation for when, like, everything's
Yeah,
non-conforming.
could you do something about that in the, it doesn't sound like there's an interest in changing, except preventing something like this.
So, okay, so the feedback we're receiving then is that we're going to be scrapping curb line, going with front parcel boundary, for front lot line language, ensuring that we're being able to clarify how that front yard is actually going to function. With that, then how fences, how stuff can actually occur in there, with this, I guess, still utilize build-to lines. If that's what I'm hearing.
I have one more comment, so there's also a part of the streetscape design, 27418, that specifically calls out Old Town, saying that buildings within Old Town District should be located adjacent to the sidewalk, which I think is desirable and, is what we have in most of Old Town. My only comment would be, we took a lot of Old Town and made it these neighborhood commercial districts. And so I personally am in favor of keeping Old Town as the recommendation to build to the sidewalk, as most buildings are. And I would just comment that, to me, it makes sense if we were to extend that to those new neighborhood commercials. I think Old Town currently up at the top of the ordinance, where we have those pictures of the designs, it does say between 0 and 10. I would think for Old Town, we don't want people continually pushing buildings back in Old Town. At least, I don't think so. Again, just my thoughts. So I would say we eliminate that for Old Town and consider eliminating it for the neighborhood commercials as well, just to, again, I think we want buildings to be right at the sidewalk there.
Any reaction to that? Marty?
So with that, then, we would put in the stipulation that design of structures in the OT and then NC1, is that what would be?
I mean, if you look at the map, I don't know, NC1, we took a lot of the like east and west of the square, NC1, but then NC2, we went all the way down Baltimore. And I mean, most things on Baltimore are up to the property line with some exceptions. Like, I don't know, Mr. G's, right, has a bit of a front kind of area for the building is. But, I mean, I would recommend all of them. I guess maybe not, I don't know where NC3 is.
That NC3.
Not NC3.
Yeah. So, okay, so this would be OT, NC1, the pink areas here, and then, yeah, this gray area for NC2. And these, I mean, it would affect these larger lots, but these are primarily developed already, the ones that are along East Middle.
Yeah, I guess my assumption there is that clause about where if the majority of houses on the street are not in conforming, then you can be non-conforming. So if someone on East Middle decided, I don't know, knock their house down and start over, they would still be able to have a setback because all the other houses on East Middle are set back.
What's your reaction to that?
I mean, that's totally doable. Wouldn't be it wouldn't be a really ridiculous change for us to make.
And do you have I mean, you're just hearing this. Do you have a recommendation related to it?
I mean, that makes sense from a historic preservation. When we look at the town, and specifically NC2 is, I mean, that's really encouraging pedestrian transit from Steinway up to the square. So, I mean, you really do want to have a pedestrian-friendly environment. Generally, for an urban scale, that would mean having buildings that are in close proximity to the right-of-way. Now, how that pedestrian space is actually delivered, I mean, that's something the borough is going to be overtaking in the next year, well, not just next year, but the next many years, in revamping Baltimore Street. So, yeah, I mean, by having those provisions, that would be something that would be beneficial and would be promoting a healthier economic development climate that's in keeping with our tourism and our other goals associated with the land use plan. So that's something, I mean, if
and it sort of responds to that dynamic concept, but not fully from what Sue was saying.
The only concern I had, it seems that if we keeping the language that allows for those non-conforming areas or where there's no clear delineations, giving them the ability to set their own front setback that's in accordance with the underlying build to line requirement for, because there's already going to be a district requirement that they would still have to meet. So I'm okay with that provision then with the streetscape.
Okay, I know this isn't wrapping it up in complete clarity, but are there any objections to moving on and allowing staff to take what they heard now? You okay?
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
Yeah, no objection
Okay.
is what I'm saying.
All right, let's move on.
Can I just clarify
Yes.
one other thing? So, and I think, and I appreciate letting Sue speak there because I think I understand her concern a little bit more because it's how we measure it that's the confusing part, but it's really about what's allowed in the front yard. And I think the main concern there is that 6-foot fences shouldn't be allowed in the front yard, I think is what she's suggesting.
Your front yard is between your house.
Yeah, and so we could just say that. I think we could take a look at the fence requirement and just say that 6-foot fences aren't allowed between your, in cases where your house is beyond the build-to requirement, you're still not allowed to have a 6-foot high fence there. So somehow we can say that.
Or a swimming pool.
Or a swimming pool, all right.
That little sketch that I.
Yeah.
Okay,
I
great.
think we can clean that up.
Yes.
Now, I'd like to, is it possible to move an item up on the agenda? Or since we already said it, is it set?
If you want to amend your agenda, you can amend your agenda.
I'm just thinking the gentleman who came in to speak about one issue, that we're not getting to that until item number 5, and I'd like to maybe pull that up to right now. Do I need a vote and everything? Okay, so I'm going to move that we move item 5 zoning map to above item 2.
I have a correction to make too. It says January 2024. It should be 2025.
Great.
for the next meeting.
Excellent. Okay, so we'll change that on the agenda. Double motion. Is there a second?
I'll second that motion.
Any discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, so now let's turn to the zoning map, and there were a number of items. I think it makes sense since there are individuals here who made a specific request related to, is it 100 York Street? Yep. So John, would you mind, you sent us that email just before the meeting, and we heard a little bit about what it was tonight. Do you want to talk us through that?
Okay. So as it's currently proposed, 100 York Street is the larger rectangular parcel right there that's this pink color. It's currently zoned Old Town, which is this more dark red. Directly to the rear is general commercial, and here is the boundary indicating that it is in the historic district. The property itself, we've had a lot of challenges in trying to zone this parcel. It's a historic structure. It's a very unique historic structure, and we initially had it as a split zone, recognizing the desire to have tour operations in this building. It's currently, the status of the structure, the use is a hotel. So even with the change that's proposed, it would be non-conforming. However, they'd be able to conform by switching to an inn. The accessory tour operations is very common in other hotel uses, but it's not permitted in the NC1 district under any circumstance. So if it's something that the Planning Commission would like to see, that tour operations is having the ability to operate in these NC1 districts, staff would recommend either a special exception or just permitting them by right, although the special exception does seem more in keeping with the other provisions for like NC2. So NC2, it makes a lot of sense because that is a tourism corridor. NC1, I believe it was removed. It was just so that it was trying to eliminate the potential for tour operations in the more residential areas.
So your recommendation is not to rezone this, but to include the use?
Yeah.
Now, the use, if you want to pull that up, I think everyone should look at it. It includes items related to lot area and stabling of livestock and insurance and hours of operation. So we want to make sure that we're comfortable with that in this NC district.
As you can see, it's permitted with special exception in this is the NC2 district. It's not permitted in NC1 or NC3.
And then if you go to the definition,
So tour operator, any person, corporation, or other entity engaged in the business of providing tours to consumers via means of tour guide lead or self-guided tours of the borough and nearby attractions by means of walking, biking, horse-drawn carriages, pedicab, and or electrical personal assistive mobility device. That's little segues to customers. The following supplemental use regulations apply, and then that's where we get 7,000 square foot minimum lot area. If there's livestock, they can't be used like for actual stabling, so that agricultural aspect of tour operations isn't going to be happening. There's an indemnification, so since they're going to be operating on public right-of-ways, we require some insurance, and we have the guided walking tour application license itself handles a lot of that aspect. There's the insurance requirement. Then with the hours of operation, the 6 a.m. to 11 p.m. That's something. It's kind of limited if it's a non. The reason being, if you could still feasibly have tours occurring after this time, but you're not going to have individuals congregating and meeting at your location. It would be you'd do it more like you see ghost tours operating today in the borough. They meet at a public place. They're not necessarily meeting at a business at those like at 4 a.m. So that way it would be something that's more compatible with the those higher density residential uses near the NC1 district.
okay. But just again, why is it more favorable to include the use rather than to just extend Old Town one parcel over?
So when developing the map, one of the concerns that staff raised to the consultant is that when you start, in the event you break a natural, I'm using air quotes, natural, because if you break a geographical boundary that's obvious and allow for like the Old Town use then to occur in this parcel, it could be used as justification for allowing that district to further expand the entire way for
Okay.
the block.
Understand.
I'd be willing to accept a special exception for
In
this.
the whole NC District 1? Okay.
I'll just comment on my personal opinion, but I remember this conversation from the meetings that we had as a committee.
Okay.
And it was that distinction specifically. It was on one hand, the committee at the time did not feel comfortable extending the tour operator to the entirety of NC2
Right.
because we thought that there was other areas where it might not be appropriate. Asked the question about extending Old Town, got in the conversation about that, what John just mentioned. So that's why we left it as is. So not to say my personal opinion either way, but just to give a little background.
Well, do you remember what the harms were to the whole district? Or if this was included, is this going to be negative to the whole NC2 district somehow? Or some part of it?
I think just, conversation around, and maybe Sarah can remember as well. Just, I think general tour operations, loading and unloading in what we were intending to be a more residential area. Now, I do think since the inception of NC2 and what it is now, there's a lot more commercial uses allowed than I think we originally were thinking. So I don't know that that same thinking stands nowadays, but I think it was just general, not wanting a potentially disruptive with public-facing business operating in what was intended to be getting closer to a residential district.
Jenny, did you have your hand up?
Oh, I was just going to say that I agree with Marty, and that was what I had come to, was going to be my question when I got the email late this afternoon.
I guess I'm okay with it. I'm trying to think about the NC2 and how many 7,000 square foot buildings there are.
This is NC1 though, right?
Oh, NC1, right, NC1.
NC1, I might have said NC2.
You said
sorry,
NC2, yeah,
NC1.
that's-
Sorry, it's allowed in NC2. Special exception.
There are larger parcels. I believe, I'm not exactly sure that 100 York Street is one that would, in discussing this, I can look that up really quick.
I think it's listed online as 0.25 acres, which is about 10,000. So
Okay.
I had this exact same thought, and I just looked it up. That's
Okay,
all.
yeah,
I've
so
just
then that's
memorized
good
the
then.
parcels.
So, John, any concerns you have about adding this use?
No, in discussion, our big concern from the borough is going to be congestion caused by tours. That can be both the loading and unloading of buses, horse-drawn carriages to a lesser extent, but those large buses, large vehicles, that's something that we get a lot of negative comments about, especially in the residential areas. It is a little bit more challenging to regulate, getting the bus drivers to turn them off and things like that, so there isn't a lot of exhaust. Those are the problems we know we're having today. The NC1 in particular, I'm okay with a special exception. I don't think we should go any further unless we're going to be revisiting NC2 as well, because really these uses should be on larger parcels, and that's allowing for it as a special exception is one thing, but I don't think it should necessarily be encouraged.
Okay. All right. So the Marty Jolin plan is special exception in the NC1 district, and I agree with it. Jenny said she agrees with it. Sarah does. Nick?
I'm not going to fight you on it.
Okay. So could you have that direction, and thank you for coming. Let's return now to parking spaces, item number 2, and that relates to a discussion was unfinished. I think, Marty, you were kind of part of that discussion about we're trying to reduce, maybe the intention was to reduce parking requirements in the borough, and we were not sure that we are or are not here.
Well, we had a provision in the previous drafts that didn't make sense. And it dealt with a reduction from the required number of parking spaces. And what we've done with this document is we've moved to a maximum parking space requirement. So what staff did, we just removed that provision. And if that's acceptable, basically it was a provision that allowed for the reduction in required parking. The only time that would become feasible is if an applicant is required to do a parking study. So that's why I thought it would be best to just remove it, as which case then you have, since the only challenge is going to come from a parking study, well, if you have the study, you should probably be following it. That was staff's thinking.
So we received, thank you, Sue Sipperly, another email last evening related to this, and she said that there is still the detailed chart, but is that?
Well, there is the chart, but it's it's the maximum number. So here, I'll pull it up. Maybe I'll pull it up. So this gives an example. You can't have like a single family detached. You're going to be limited to 2 parking spaces. You wouldn't be able to make 3. That's what the chart's saying now with this proposal. As it is, this would limit parking, off-street parking development. That's what it will do. It will also enable additional residential development and commercial development, as they will not have to pay. That parking space eats up into land area. It has associated costs with it. And you can generally, in terms of modern trends in planning, the idea is with a reduction in parking spaces, in a requirement, you enable additional housing opportunity.
Let me just jump in. Single-family detached, 2 parking spaces per lot. So driveways, I think many driveways have like 4 spots in them.
Like yours, is that what you're talking about?
Mine does, yes.
Many.
But many in Cold Park do, and
Cross-street neighborhood.
several. So we'd all become non-conforming, and
Yeah. Yes.
Yes, John, what is the question of, or what's the answer to, like, what's a parking lot and what's a parking space and which is a space where I park my car? So, like, if I have, a driveway and then I continue and put a car on some gravel in front of that driveway on the side of my house.
If we were directed by the administration to do enforcement when it comes to parking, one of the issues we run into is when we have designs that enable people to park in driveways, which it should possibly be used as a drive aisle, or it may be a situation where someone's parking on gravel, which loose surface isn't permitted. That's an MS4 violation. We haven't had that direction. And I don't think it would necessarily be something that's going to come up as it relates to legal pre-existing non-conforming parking spaces. But this would affect new development. So when you have, if there was a situation where parcels like Colt Park, you could feasibly consolidate parcels, redevelop them, and have more housing. But at the same time, then those houses would have to have fewer parking spaces than what's currently going on.
I mean, Colt Park I'm in low-density
neighborhood,
residential,
yeah.
but you can park on the street, too. There's plentiful on-street parking that's free. So I personally am not concerned about these maximums, is I guess what I'm trying to get at.
The intention is, though, that, or if there was redevelopment, that we want more building mass than parking? I'm just not understanding, because this would, like, your street has many driveways that have 4-car driveways, and so does mine. So what's the intention to?
It's not really the effect isn't going to be as profound with single-family detached housing. When it comes to multifamily housing, it becomes very very good incentive. Especially when we look at our Old Town area where we have our high-density housing is usually on smaller lots. If that space has to be used for parking, it's going to impact the pro forma and possibly limit the amount of housing or any space that can be developed on site. The alternative this isn't the only alternative, but the general alternative, the current system, parking minimums. The problem with parking minimums is that creates the Walmart effect, where it's only full like for a couple more days this month. You get 10 more shopping days.
I think this commission moved away from that thinking
Yes.
a while ago on parking minimums. This just surprised me on maximums I was thinking more commercial parking and not residential in this regard, but
Well, it's all uses.
sure.
Um,
1 second, go ahead.
In general, I think I'm behind this idea of changing to parking maximums, but I wanted to just, in this meeting, say something that I've said in our small committee group, which is that, I guess the only concern I have is that at one point I lived in the Old Town district where a parking space was not provided with an apartment, and it's a huge pain in the butt. And I would hope that the borough would consider ways to alleviate that for people who do choose to live in downtown apartments. And if landlords decide not to provide parking for their residents, or they decide to rent a parking space to someone else and not provide it for their residents, and this could create an issue for people who want to live in the borough and happen to own cars. So I think that can be resolved with our, what's it called? Residential parking program, by expanding that or thinking about that in different ways about allowing residents to park in other locations long-term. So I just wanted to put that out there for consideration if this does seem to be an issue for people who live in apartments that aren't provided with parking spaces.
I think that's a really important point because I could see how the landlord could take advantage of this in a way that you might say, well, someone doesn't have to rent from that particular landlord if they're not given parking. However, we know that there are housing problems in Gettysburg. So I do think it's the Planning Commission's responsibility to think that one through. And if there's a way to, we don't have any responsibility over the RPP though, so that's not in the zoning ordinance.
I mean, you're still providing the opportunity for parking spaces. When it comes to these requirements, the goal that I guess staff is presenting with this document is to maximize the land of the borough, and when going into this, the parking, it's a benefit, but the overall goal for this document was to increase housing opportunities, and that's what has driven this from staff's perspective.
Yeah, and we need to move on, but I mean, you certainly can understand the balancing of that, of the type of housing and the way that people inhabit housing in the borough. It's part of the consideration. So I think we're probably debating something that's minor, but.
Possibly.
All right, Sue, very quickly, you want to jump into this, please?
Part of this, instead of just saying, well, we got parking spaces and we got buildings, there's also green space and stormwater concerns. And what I'm hearing is if we have fewer parking spaces, then we can fill the lot up more with buildings. So you also have to consider the stormwater part of this. And some green, in other parts you've said
Yeah.
nice to have some green. So it's not just about parking spaces and buildings maximized. You also
Right.
have
Well, in our saldo, we will have requirements for landscaping and things that potentially handle that. But the charge to increase housing is just needing to be balanced by a few other items. And do you think that? Well, you've given us your recommendation. So
Charles, can I ask one question before we move on? Can you scroll up a little bit, John? Are you saying that the section that we took out was that B1C, right before, it's right at the beginning of the table? Okay, so C, I believe, was the paragraph there that we were confused about. So I just wanted to point that out to you, make a note that paragraph doesn't make sense anymore, I
Yeah.
believe.
Oh, I thought we already, so that has not been removed yet.
Pretty sure that's the one that we need to either fix or strike. It just,
Yeah,
Sarah brought
that's
this
the
up
one.
when we were over
Yeah.
at the Charlie Sterner building.
Okay, so we already decided that to strike that. Marty, did you have any other comments on parking? So individuals are okay with this chart?
And one other quick thing, just to make sure we're happy with, so right above that B, and just to make sure that you guys still remember and you understand correctly, if you want to go over any of these maximums, you had to submit a study to be able to prove that you need more than the maximum permitted by ordinance. That study, according to that section right there, needs to go to the zoning hearing board. Is that where you want it, or do you guys want it with yourselves? I just want to make sure that it was clear that it's currently going to the zoning hearing board. It's
Cheaper for them to come to us than to the
It
zoning
seemed
hearing
like
board.
it seemed like maybe an odd way of determining parking. I mean, if somebody wants a variance of a parking requirement, well, yeah, that has to go to zoning hearing board. But just to send them to the zoning hearing, just to do the study, that seems like a planning commission or a borough council thing, kind of. I
It'd
don't
be
know.
more expensive and more time consuming, just given the, generally, more time consuming, I would think, if that's of concern to you.
Zoning hearing.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, since we deal with parking issues a lot, I think it would make sense for us to review a document like that, since we are familiar with parking requirements. But given it's in zoning, can we do that?
This would require the establishment of conditional uses, which we do not have.
And that would
currently.
go to the borough council.
Yeah.
With a planning recommendation.
Mhm.
Yeah, but you'd be creating a whole other class of zoning. You don't have conditional uses right now. You have special exceptions before the ZHB.
Hmm.
The analysis is the same. It's just a question of which body is hearing it.
There would be expenses, but you end up with the same process that all special exceptions go through. It is special conditions that are in keeping with what a special exception actually is. It's guaranteeing that the information provided to the zoning hearing board, I mean, yes, it's more challenging at the same time. Hopefully, once we get to a point with the Saudo ordinance, or once we get with these new developments, I mean, this is something that's not really occurring too often. And when it is, often the issue is the developer's asking for parking that's less than the issue. So it's not, at this point, we wouldn't recommend, staff wouldn't recommend a change from that special exception process, but I mean, if it's something that the commission wants to explore, we can look into it.
Well, I was just reacting to what Chad said, but you're saying we'd have to create conditional
Mhm.
uses, which we don't currently do, so.
I mean, the only other, there is places in the ordinance where it defers to the zoning officer or the borough engineer or something like that, where but that's getting pretty soft, now it's just the staff that's making that decision. I don't know anywhere in there that it says you go to the planning commission for the decision.
It would just be for Saldo. That would be the
That's the only way they're coming
opportunity
to you.
then.
Yeah.
All right, Marty.
I'll let you two figure it out.
Doesn't
but-
sound like we're changing
It
it.
sounds like we're going to keep it the way it is. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in my opinion, we're trying to create maximums, and so if you want to go over a maximum, it's a process.
They could probably just fudge the numbers too, and
Okay, well,
Would
moving
encourage
on. All right, let's consider that. Any further comment or objection to moving forward on parking? Sue did give us these charts from this book, but it sounds like the maximum is where we're still. Okay, the R1. We have one remaining item in R1 related to single-family residential district duplex.
Yeah, so I had an opportunity to go through
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, yes. And
Middle Street.
yeah, and this is a big one. All right, let's go. Middle Street land use discussion.
So with the Middle Street land use, staff reviewed the parcels along, East Middle Street. Let me pull up my data unfortunately was corrupted, but I still have the notes. Roughly, there's 4 parcels, of which 14 are non-residential. Those 14 that are non-residential generally are larger parcels. If I can pull this thing up, there we go. They include like Kenny's Market. There's some office spaces right here that are along South Washington. A few of them encroach a little further in West Middle. There's a Foursquare Church. There is a Memorial retail store right there. A few medical clinics, podiatrists, the A&C&B Bank, and then Sites Realty. The overall, looking at the R2 district as it affects those clinic uses, that is nonconformity. So they would become legal pre-existing non-conforming uses under the proposed zoning map. The request from Foursquare to be changed to general commercial could occur. It would not be spot zoning, as there is adjoining general commercial. In the event that were to be a suggested change, we would probably also recommend picking up the Memorial Company. The issue, though, is we're talking about 14 commercial properties, and there are a substantial number of residential properties along West Middle. Any encouragement of commercial development, while beneficial to the tax base, there are certain nuisances that are created, especially when it comes to large truck traffic and other commercial deliveries that would be occurring during people's enjoyment of their own personal property. So it's I guess the existing zoning, for the most part, we have this R2 district, the Elm Street area. Generally, it's the areas that we're talking about that were in the Elm Street, they are residential. So it's really something that I'm not seeing the necessary change to make all these parcels general commercial. I'm also not seeing the necessity to change the Foursquare or the Memorial. Now, that's something that if the Planning Commission would like to do, we can definitely make that feasible. The uses, especially so Foursquare, it's a church place of worship, is a permitted land use in the R2 district. The office building uses are permitted. The financial institution, that was the other one. I need to go back and make sure. But that's another caveat one where it's an automotive use. It's occurring already. It's not necessarily the end-all be-all of the development of the property. It could one day potentially be residential. Is it going to be immediately converted to residential? Probably not. But at the same time, is changing it to general commercial going to change the dynamic of the area? It would potentially do that. So
first, Foursquare Church wrote to me and by extension the Planning Commission with a further analysis of why they believe they should be considered commercial. And so I'll give this to John to enter into our minutes. And I think the gist of this argument is that when we said, well, you can have a church in what's the district again? R2. Their response was, well, we do more things than the definition of church, and they listed a number of things that they do, that from childcare to, let me find it here so I don't. Childcare facility, Mission of Mercy, medical and dental clinic, temporary shelter for the homeless through CARES, playground, things that serve food, and so forth. So that's one argument they made. I'm just furthering this so we make sure that we hear their concern. And then also that they are in such close proximity to Rite Aid, Kenny's, and the beer distributor, and that apparently at one point in this process, the planning director before you, John, said that the building classified the church, Rite Aid, and High Street as commercial properties. So that's, I think, what their surprise was. Yeah, you can take it. So that's one point. Was there ever a consideration of allowing it to be low-impact neighborhood commercial? So you would allow the bank and the real estate agency and printing shop and things to serve and to be involved in that type of business, but nothing that includes the general commercial, which I think is what our fears were.
My understanding was that was considered, the concern was when removing the Elm Street overlay district. And it goes back to, these are areas where there is residential opportunity.
Okay.
That shopping center that's there on Middle Street, is that in the red area or the?
Yeah, that's general.
It's that like triangular.
That's
red
general
area.
commercial.
Triangular area?
Yeah.
I was just wondering how that's.
Yeah.
figured in.
Okay, any reaction to what John said about moderate density residential in this whole stretch, or is there any appetite for allowing a more commercial district?
I don't favor a reason to change what is currently shown on the map. If it was changed, I would support the NC1 rather than a change to commercial.
But could we put like one parcel of NC?
But yeah, I don't think we'd shoot just one parcel. I feel like it would be more of
The whole.
Whole stretch.
all of Middle Street or something, but.
No, I mean, I'm sympathetic to some of it, although I also agree with John that, that is, in my mind, a residential neighborhood with some office buildings. And as they get redeveloped, like one of them is the electric building, or no, the telephone,
Yeah, that nothing happened. I mean, that.
which opening the door for general commercial type uses. So yeah, I guess if we were to change it,
It's on Middle? Or is
Yeah.
it?
yeah, I would only support something that was low impact commercial or, low impact neighborhood commercial. But
Yeah.
you which allows residential, doesn't it?
It does. I'll pull that up.
And I should also add, the Foursquare seems to think Borough Council is going to make the change anyway. So share
Well,
that little piece of
That is
information.
their right. I mean, my opinion, two things. One, as I said in previous meetings, individual property owners, obviously, you want to maximize what you can do with your property. I would love if my property in the middle of low-density residential, you could do whatever you want because I could sell it for higher. So unfortunately, we are deciding with input from the community, what we think is best for the community, not for one individual parcel.
Sure.
My response to the argument for Foursquare, I always get confused with Foursquare. I appreciate the argument that Foursquare is moderate R2, while Kenny's, the shopping center, High Street Brews are GC. I would recommend changing them to R2 rather than changing the church to GC, because again, we wanted to develop more residential there. And obviously we're talking as if we pass this and, everyone's going to sell their building, demolish it, and build new stuff. I mean, this is a slow process. But in those areas, if they were to be demolished or something, my personal opinion is we want to see residential uses. I think the only thing I will say, my last thing is, I know we got in a conversation last meeting around, it was still R2, but it was along Carlisle Street and allowing for some more commercial uses. And so maybe we keep it R2, whatever, but then do we have a conversation about, are there some other commercial uses that can be allowed in R2, which was, I think, Sue brought that up, and then I think Sarah and you were in favor of that along the Carlisle. Yeah, I'm saying, but those are both R2. So my personal opinion is we leave this R2, but then as a compromise, do we look at R2 as a whole, and are there more commercial uses that we can add to R2 that feel blended, neighborhood and commercial, that would then allow this property owner to have more potential commercial uses in the future while staying in R2?
So I think we need to move this one forward, and I'm sure John does not want to revisit the R2, but if there are, as we're talking here, some that you can think of that would be that compromise. I just want to affirm the part where you said that the residential, I see this area as residential with some specific types of offices or commercial enterprises within it. So I support keeping it residential still, and recognize that R2 permits a certain type of commercial, but that the primary feel and use of that district is residential. So I agree with you, Nick.
Yeah, I mean, I walk that street every day.
And even the development of Kenny's, even though that's general commercial, it's connected to this residential. It abuts this residential, and there was lots of consideration to make that a grocery store that fits in a neighborhood. Even though it's zoned general commercial, it can do that use. There was a lot of attention to the development of Kenny's, I believe, and Rite Aid too, landscaping and the way the parking lot is. And so, does anyone have additional comment on this, or do we just continue to maintain what we have in the proposed?
I think we should maintain it and not revisit R2.
Not
As far-
revisit R2.
Correct, as far as different commercial uses and things. That's,
Well, I was just asking if there are any that seem to jump out, but what do others think?
The only, and I don't want to open up a can of worms, so John,
We
we
are
can
moving
follow up
forward.
with this, but my only thought from the conversation, thinking more about Carlisle, was, is there a way to zone for those type of mixed use where the building has like a first floor commercial, right? That's some type of store, shop, but then guaranteeing that second and plus floors are residential? Because like that, I could see would be a perfect compromise, I think, for this property. Let's say something happens to it. They redo the building where we have a business on the first floor, but then I think it's 3 stories, that building is 3 or 4, then you've got residential up there. That kind of helps with, well, I just don't know. We didn't really get into that with Mike Baker International.
Well, no, we don't, we do. And the reason it probably wasn't brought up is we have a funky provision that allows for multiple principal uses on one parcel. So you can have a mixed-use dwelling by default. It's just the big change from NC1, the one that's jumping out to me to go to Charles's point, general commercial service uses is what really differentiates the NC1 from R2. Those are pretty much all retail sales establishments. That was something the R2, the commercial it allows, but very limited. It's office. It's that type of revenue generation, as opposed to having cars coming in, parking, buying a lottery ticket, going back in their car, and like really trying to make it so that it has minimal nuisance to residential.
Would there be any interest in including that by special exception in R2?
I mean, is there a way to zone that we could put a use that would guarantee a mixed dwelling, a mixed business, mixed primary use?
You could do that. We could establish a mixed use building, mixed use dwelling, whatever we want to call it. In which case, then it would establish in the definition for the use that the first story would be a commercial or office. Well, you'd want it to be commercial. If you make it office, then the dynamics of the structure, like the rents become a little funky, and it makes more sense just having an office building. So yes, making that mixed use residential, the traditional residential up top, commercial on the first floor, and then we could say that would be permitted in the R2 or whatever other districts you would like, and then having it establish that you would have that mixed use happening as opposed to just a commercial activity.
But to be clear, I think you would also have to eliminate the other uses if you wanted to mandate that like, there's a difference between allowing that to happen and requiring only that to happen. So you'd have to if you want it to be mixed use with commercial and residential, then you got to get rid of commercial or residential.
Sure,
Yeah, no, and maybe I misspoke. I guess, and again, this is just my personal opinion to inform our conversation. I was against allowing more uses in R2 in the last couple of meetings, and I think listening to feedback, to me, that seems like a fair compromise would be allowing something like that where we would allow some more general commercial uses, like Sue, you mentioned, like maybe a coffee shop on Carlisle, but trying to still get at this idea of providing more residences. And so you'd have your coffee shop, but then the second story would be, a couple apartment units, something like that.
I'm just noting that we do already have general, I like that, but I'm sure that that's not going to fulfill the concerns of some of the residents who want, or some of the property owners. And we already have non-conforming uses in R2.
Yeah.
Bank is a non-conforming use. Real estate agency, I imagine, is a non-conforming use.
Medical clinic, it's those more heavy transit oriented. You gotta have customers coming in and out. Those are not permitted in the R2.
But they exist and.
They do.
Yeah. Sarah or Jenny or Marty, do you have any comment on either Nick's idea to add this other use, or the potential to include by special exception general commercial in the R2, or to just leave this discussion and move forward? John?
I would just note, if you went with the special you could do both. You could do it with special exception and make one of the conditions for special exception that in the R2 district you have a mixed-use dwelling.
Okay.
I think that sounds like a really good compromise there, have a special exception.
Agreed.
And if somebody really wants to do something big, they can go for a variance.
Yeah.
And get that done. These are just.
Okay. It doesn't, I like the idea, it just doesn't directly hit at what probably many of these people want to do, but that's okay. It shows, some movement.
I
All
mean,
right.
Not that this should be the solution that you should pursue or mentally think is going to solve every issue, but the ordinance can and will be revised. I mean, unfortunately, after doing all this work, people are going to come forward and request rezonings or request text amendments. It's just going to happen. So if there is, I'll say, extenuating circumstances and council wants to make a legislative determination to amend the ordinance, it certainly has the right to do that.
Yeah. And I think.
Not that you want that to be
No,
the
I
end all
got you.
be all,
And
but-
I think Nick reminds us of our mission here, which is to think about these districts, not properties, and what those districts are supposed to be. And we've just done our job, I think, with that. We think this district is a neighborhood of residences that happens to have some commercial going on. And we want to be flexible, but not abandon our direction. Is that what I understand?
Yeah, well put.
Okay, so let's move to, you got that, John, for the creating a new special exception, but with the caveat that you mentioned?
Is that would this apply to all commercial activities, or
I think just
just
because
the general
commercial, because that has a nice chart of
Yeah.
3.03, what that includes.
and those, and then ensuring that it is the condition of which it's a mixed-use dwelling,
Yes.
a mixed-use building.
Yeah. Okay. Again, if anyone wants to comment at the end, that's possible too, but we want to respect time and move to the duplex and the R1.
Okay, so this was actually pretty easy. This was a concern that was raised, is that there's there's not a lot, but there are non-single family dwellings occurring in the R1 district. That's not really the case. Almost uniformly, the single family dwellings, R1 single family residential district is occupied with parcels that have single family dwellings. There are total, I was able to identify, 6 duplexes in the R1 district out of hundreds of parcels. The most of all of those are built and designed very compatibly with the surrounding parcels, so there's not really a break in harmony. There's an example from Seminary Ave. Here is West Lincoln. There's the Pizza House. What else? We got Getty Street. This is one that's not necessarily matching. It appears to be more of a built from scale of economics as opposed to the more historic architecture that's preferred. And then looking at Carlisle, I was unable to pull that one up directly, but it's another one of these brick structures that's in keeping with the more, it has better architectural flair than what you'd see with just a like metal siding built single story. That's all. So that's all to say that there are, I believe, 2 examples where it comes up as a condo, but it's not condo, but it's duplex, but it's actually more like an accessory dwelling unit. overall, the built environment doesn't, I mean, we're talking a handful of examples, so it's not something I think that you should necessarily worry about.
Okay. I can't recall exactly where the concern came.
The concern, just that we're making sure that we're zoning these areas correctly so that they are R1.
Okay.
And that's a pretty uniform district.
Okay. All right, any concerns? All right, let's move on. We moved the map, but I recognize that there might be another item related to the map that, in addition to what we already decided, or a couple.
So, looking at the changes, the Red Patch Avenue parcel is now being identified as R1. The parcels to the south of Steinway are now identified as CI. This gray color for B2, or NC2, I should say, we're going to be getting that changed. There was just an error with PDF. Let's see. This area was previously identified as industrial. It's been changed to general commercial. I believe, I want to say that that's all.
There was another CI that came up.
Yeah, let me.
The monument, or what's it called? Yep.
Oh, okay. So that's the, is that the one where it's there is the building, but it's right here?
This was, it's right now it's R2.
No, that's
Okay.
And
Confederate. So those like big houses on Confederate in the seminary.
that's a week.
So what we're talking about is that there's some civic institutional property that's like property owned by the national park or the government, and we're making sure that that's reflected in our zoning ordinance.
This R1 here is actually part of this neighborhood.
Okay, I think I'm following, yes.
Maybe this was changed to NC something. What is this pink?
Where's Eastwater? Okay, so in looking at these parcels on the screen here,
Right.
let's see. So then the request would be, this
big-
parcel right here is owned by the National Park Service.
Yes,
Right.
that's right.
The street in the yellow also belongs
Yeah.
to the park. And there's an actual physical fence along the north of that property. You can't walk from Victor Street to,
Yeah.
without crawling through a fence. But what I was showing here was the big oddly shaped parcel on the right-hand side there that's purple.
Oh, this,
This one.
okay, yeah, this.
That actually faces Victor, and that's a lot of floodplain
Yeah.
down in there. So I just make the R1 line, consider that neighborhood.
So these three parcels changing to R1.
All right, so let's continue this and deal with all of these that you just mentioned. So, John, you made those corrections, and you're asking for additional.
Well, I guess the request is to have these.
Well, I'm talking about from where you started before this.
Yeah.
Was there any question you had on those? The ones you just went around the borough saying you made a change on? That was,
Those are the ones we had previously
okay.
identified, yeah.
So the only one left is this latest thing about Coster Avenue.
Yeah.
And it reminds me similar to changing the armory. You made that to C1.
Yeah.
No, you took it out of C1 and made it,
Believe that one's
that's the
still
one on
R1A.
Red Patch.
No, I believe that one's still C1.
Oh, okay. So the red patch was the person's property, the private homeowner.
Yeah.
But remember, we talked about on West Confederate Avenue, the armory is the only building in C1, and C1 currently doesn't permit buildings.
Yeah, so I believe it's this large parcel right here.
So that, remember, we did discuss what to do about that. Because there's some discussion, I've heard stories that there might be some redevelopment of that, and if they're in C1, they won't be able to do it.
But I don't think well, okay, so that parcel, we have R1A right here and R1. Feasibly, the planning commission could make a recommendation to have this individual parcel zoned a different district. That does present the potential for a spot zoning challenge. Now, I get a little washy on this one because it becomes a court issue when establishing what is spot zoning. An individual parcel does not necessarily mean it is spot zoning, but that's generally the standard. So we wouldn't recommend.
Yeah,
the
it's just,
change.
it's an unusual situation though, because I think in the definition of C1, there cannot be structures.
Yeah, it's really meant to be open spaces, monuments.
Right, and this is a historic, I think
Yeah.
it's a historic building. I don't know the history of the Armory. It's a historic building that we'd want people to take care of and do something with perhaps, and how best to handle that.
Since they already have a building there, I think they'd be allowed to renovate it
Okay.
however they wanted.
But what would the uses be? Because, see,
I think they're proposing office.
I've only, but that use would not be permitted in C1, so they have to come to the zoning hearing board. And I don't know who I'm talking about, really. I really don't know the background here. I just heard.
I think we can, that's the process then, so.
It seems like a very unique situation.
Yeah, so.
I'll leave it at that.
So don't worry too much about it because of that?
I'm thinking unique in terms of a variance,
Okay,
perhaps.
gotcha. Okay,
Since we're looking at it, I think that green rectangle that your cursor's on now, the northwest part of that, I think there's a home there.
yes.
No, I mean, I'm looking at Google Maps right now from the satellite view, and Red Patch Ave goes like up, or is that Private Road Armory, John, that you just had? Yes. Okay, then I'm good. Thank you. Sorry, I'm good.
Oh,
Sorry about that. Thanks, guys.
Okay, so it sounds like in a unique case, there is a way, there's a path for whomever would want to work through it. All right, now, John, then maybe let's talk about what Sue Sipperly mentioned, and you're just reacting to it now, but do you have any advice?
No, I mean, that makes sense. I've actually been working with the owner of this property. It's a single-family dwelling, and, I mean, she's correct. It fronts Victor Street, so it would make sense for it to be R1. There is potential harm in it being NC1, so I can see an issue with that.
Okay, does anyone have objection to giving staff the recommendation to make that R1? And then what about the national park land? What would that become? CI.
Yeah.
So can you do that?
Well, I wouldn't recommend that.
Okay, why?
That once you're running into an issue again with spot zoning. This is the use of the property is the MPS, is it going to change? And if it does change, I mean, if there's a federal law associated with that change, that's going to have precedence over this ordinance.
Okay.
I wouldn't recommend it because it's not. I don't foresee it being something that would be a detriment. And in the event, let's say the MPS says, "Hey, let's give it to a private developer," it might not be out of the realm of possibilities. If that were to happen, how would the planning commission want it to be developed?
And that is NC.
We're recommending an NC1.
Okay. Any objections to that, to taking
So
John's?
just for clarification, so the three houses on Victor Street will become, or are you saying just?
R1.
The three, okay. Yep, I support that.
And why would you not make the park land R1 if it doesn't, it's.
Oh, okay, so not C1, what about R1 for the parkland?
But wait, the parkland isn't facing Victor Street, which the other ones are, I think was the argument, wasn't it?
Can we point out on the map what you mean when you say parkland? I'm sorry.
Just,
That's true. Okay, thank you.
That's what I was talking about then.
It doesn't face any, it faces the outlet. And if it can't be the green CI, why would you make it commercial?
John, why would we make it commercial and not residential?
So I'm pulling up the location of the parcel right now on the tax map assessment to give an idea of the. Let's see. How about I go to the correct area?
Oh, I know where that is.
There on your right.
Yeah, yeah. I didn't realize.
There it is.
Yeah, see, that's not on Victor.
Okay.
Right.
Oh.
Down here. Whoa.
There we go. So
It's not as intuitive.
parcel fronts along Hazel Alley. Adjoining property is not residential in the traditional sense. It would be something where, let's see if the frontage of the parcel would not, well, it probably would. Let me do a quick calculation.
I can guarantee you the Park Service will never develop it.
So that's like, I understand why
Right, so it's probably
it's
within
in
that
might as well
point.
put it zoned.
Historic place. And it also has the Custer.
So it's 67.2 feet. I do not believe it would be wide enough. It would be we'd have to consider that a legal pre-existing non-conforming parcel. So it would be something where it could be developed into R1. I don't have the staff would offer no opinion on it.
Well, if we're in the interest of more residential and it's never going to be developed anyway, is there any objection to making that R1?
Nope.
No.
Okay, let's move on then. I think the map is finished enough.
We deem it done. Yeah.
What's that old armory in? What?
C1, Civic Institutional. CI, I'm sorry, thank you.
Oh, CI.
CI, Civic Institutional.
Have a business in there?
No, you cannot. No.
You cannot.
Yeah, so they'll have to deal with their own, whoever owns it will just have to handle it through the process. Okay, general information handout. This, I believe, is John working up with our input some way to present this to council in the new year, where they can understand where we've been and what we've experienced and what has changed.
Yes, I'd hope to have that completed prior to this meeting. We were not able to do that.
But I understand.
We'll be getting that out. We'll work to get the revised ordinance, the revised map online Friday. There'll just be a short handout explaining the differences from the existing ordinance and just the mission that was established in creating the ordinance. And if something, then Planning Commission we can review and discuss separate from the actual ordinance. It would just be something to pass along to council and the general public with your justification for a recommendation.
And yeah, because I did look, but I didn't have much time because it was over the weekend, that there are only, it looks like 5 pages with changes since our last go-around. And I believe there were more.
Oh, there's a lot more.
That's
Just
what I thought.
The document really, it was in a state where it couldn't be edited very well.
Right, okay.
So that was,
So for the
now
pub-
that I have that, where there's going
Yeah,
to be some more
so for the
changes.
public, the track changes version that's online, and it's dated December 13th, I think,
Yes.
is not it's not fully edited based upon these last discussions. And we will get the edits on the 20th.
The goal is to have
The goal
them
is
prior
on the
to
20th, and then the Planning Commission can perhaps study that document. I don't mean to tell you all what to do, but perhaps we could study that document, send anything that we note from comparing it to minutes and comparing it to resident concerns to John, but then we would discuss anything at the public meeting, if anything was new. But really, there shouldn't be much new. It should just already be reflecting what we did at the meetings, and we just want to make sure that's the case.
Yes.
Okay. So now give us the process timeline, please.
Okay. We will have these materials ready by the end of the week. We will have this, and I guess, teed up, so to speak, for January. At which point, if Planning Commission, if there are still edits that are required, we will take it back to the workshop and go back, or to our workhouse, I should say, and get it ready for review in February. Regardless of, once your recommendation is complete, it goes to Borough Council. That's what kicks off then I want to say it's a 90-day. I'd have to go back and check it. I don't think it's that long now that I said it. There's a time protocol that we have to have for the public hearing, certain notification requirements. We'll have to post the ordinance in certain locations. It will be a process, and the council President Moon expressed that it will be something that they're going to be taking up very seriously in 2025. So the timeline itself for your completion, we're almost near the end of phase 2. Once we get to phase 3 with council, there will be quite a bit of review that's occurring. There may be additional requests for information from the Planning Commission by council, but it's something where we have a process that we could have this adopted by, it would be in theory early March.
Okay, thank you. Our next meeting of the Planning Commission is scheduled for Tuesday, January 21st, 2025 at 7 p.m. Are there additional comments from Planning Commission members? I would just say thank you for the public for continuing to come to these meetings and work through this with us. Also, John Rice and I were reappointed to this commission by Borough Council, so we're going to still be around for a while. And at our January meeting is when we'll choose new officers for the group.
And I just want to verify, because I always think about this every time, or this year at every time, excuse me. Council's going to advertise our meetings for next year?
That's correct.
Okay. Just want to make sure.
Yes, and now we have time for public comment on any item. And please come to the microphone.
I'm making my way there. I thought you were going to talk about Carlisle Street tonight, where you took away a perfectly good working strip of residential office, which contains a lot of different uses that are been there for a long time, turned that into R2, and then that made some of those uses non-conforming, like funeral homes and things like that. And then to take care of that, they just add those things to R2, so they won't be non-conforming. That's not how zoning should be done, and I hope you will revisit this Carlisle thing, because it's fine, it's working. It's got some huge houses there that are either owned by the college or private rentals. Right now they can be mixed-use things, and I don't know who thought of taking that away and putting it into R2, and all those uses. R2 is supposed to be residential. So bed and breakfast can be on Carlisle right now, but if you put that into R2, it's going to be competing with people looking for housing, and that's supposed to be your big push with this thing, but it's working. It's just, it's not broke, so don't try to fix it. And I just can't understand whose idea it was. So I thought you were going to talk about that tonight, but you didn't.
So I'm sorry, so can you just give us some examples of some uses that you would, so you're suggesting rather than expanding uses of R2 where part of Carlisle has been rezoned to, we should reconsider that section of Carlisle, should it be R2 or should it be something else?
It should be what it is now, which is residential office or whatever you change Baltimore Street to. They used to be the same thing. And you changed Baltimore to NC Historic, and they're very similar in terms of the age of the buildings and the size of the buildings. And
well, let's settle this. I mean, this is public comment, so
Right.
I mean, we do have a different style here of going back and forth. But what if, the decision was resolved, I thought, at the last meeting to keep it with the staff recommendation. However, in anticipation of January, if anyone has rethought their thinking on that, let John know and we put it back on for the January meeting.
I just don't know why you would even consider doing something like that. It takes away opportunities for those people who own properties there, and could benefit the adjoining neighborhood. I just don't know where the idea came from.
Thank you. Other public comment?
Hello, I am Kayla. I live at 217 East Middle Street. Thank you for hearing me today. When I was growing up, I had a dog named Tramp. When no one else in the world seemed to understand, he was there, always happy to see me, always there to listen to my secrets. I cannot tell you how many times I cried into his fur. In this society, our communion with animals is one of the few ways that we still experience nature. And no matter the kind of animal, there are thousands, if not millions, who would tell us stories of how much their non-human companions mean to them, how incredibly their presence has enhanced the quality of human life. I have met both children and elders in this town who get a faraway look in their eye at the idea of communing with chickens. I am here to argue that to keep chickens away from them is gross and inappropriate. All I see is an unnecessary, unjust imposition of restriction, a literal restriction of our constituents' freedoms. Beekeeping and chicken keeping have only been banned in this borough since 2008. The idea that the presence of these beings is destructive to the quality of life of others is frankly unfair. First of all, chickens are not roosters, if you're worried about the noise. And second, you have to factor in the concessions that some of us have already made to our quality of life for an uptick in the quality of life of others. A shining example is Bike Week. Bike Week is marvelous for everyone in power who makes money off of Bike Week. And simultaneously, there are leagues of locals who find the noise absolutely intolerable. Of course, we are expected to accept this, because Bike Week makes money. But I think the wants and needs of children are just as important as the opinions of those old enough to vote, those old enough to profit. I think wants and needs about relating to nature are spiritually and physically important, certainly as important as profit. And I do not think it is ever appropriate to restrict anything that is not doing direct harm to somebody else. Allowing the keeping of chickens and bees does no harm. It teaches us about nature and science and teaches young ones about life. And farming one's own food is both teaching and nourishing in ways that go beyond words. We can be a community who supports each other's rights and freedoms, or a community in which someone was fined $100 a day during the pandemic for supplying their own fresh eggs. That is gross, meaningless restriction, and it's who we currently are.
Thank you for those comments. And again, this is public comment time, but since this is such an important topic, and I think we have this kind of style here, I think those comments should really be directed at the Borough Council. And here's why I think that, because in the Municipal Code, Chapter 2, which we have no control over here, thankfully, it's all about animals. And you're absolutely right. The last amendments in that code are, Chapter 2, are from 2008. So the ordinance was created in 1936. I guess presumably it was allowed in 1936, and then over time it was amended in 1968 and 2008. But it would be the Borough Council that gets to do that. And if they would do that, then I think this body would then take that seriously when we give advice on the zoning. So, what would you say about that reaction? Because I think I've heard that there are others that are still interested in this topic, and maybe we could direct everyone in that path.
Yeah, I mean, if it's legal in that sense, and it's not in the zoning ordinance, and you can feasibly do it anywhere, the zoning would limit where you would be able to do it.
Right.
So
but currently we can't because it's prohibited in another
yeah, so
part
the
of the code.
council would be the best method at this time.
Thank you. Is there other public comment? Okay, then no other public comment. Is there a motion to adjourn? Jenny moves. Is there a second?
I'll second.
And Marty seconds. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
And our meeting is adjourned at 8:56 PM. Thank you all.